Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today, we are exploring the ultimate antagonist, the devil.
Right, the classic bad guy.
Exactly. But, this isn't just a ghost story. By looking at how humanity has defined evil and the devil across history, we actually uncover profound insights into how we define God, the universe, and, well, ourselves. We'll journey from ancient texts where Satan was just a courtroom job title to the radical Gnostic texts that just completely flipped the script on God entirely.
Yeah, all the way to modern atheism, where the devil is reclaimed as a powerful symbol of ultimate human freedom and rebellion.
It's a massive journey. Before we unpack this massive topic, if you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button so we can keep bringing you these deep explorations.
It really is quite the historical and philosophical journey we have mapped out for you today.
Oh, totally. And, just give a quick overview. The sources we're pulling from today provide these incredibly detailed historical analyses, plus a really comprehensive breakdown of devil concepts across world religions and secular philosophies.
Right, our mission for this deep dive is to investigate how this shifting concept of the devil acts as a mirror for human belief.
Yeah, particularly focusing on the dynamic between theistic views of God and atheistic worldviews. Because honestly, to fully understand how modern atheists and secular thinkers repurpose the devil, we first need to understand how God acquired an archenemy in the historical record.
Which is fascinating because it definitely wasn't always a given.
Right. It wasn't just built in from day one.
Not at all. I mean, if you look closely at the earliest texts of the Hebrew Bible, the notion of a supreme evil entity opposing God is completely absent.
Wait, completely absent?
Yeah, totally missing. Ancient Israelite religion originally viewed Yahweh as the author of everything. That includes both good and evil, light and dark.
Oh, wow.
In that ancient theological framework, there was simply no room, and frankly no philosophical need, for a cosmic adversary. God was entirely sovereign over all events.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the word Satan absolutely does appear in the Hebrew Bible. So what did it actually mean back then if it wasn't, a guy with red horns, hooves, and a pitchfork?
Right, so in its original Hebrew context, Satan was simply a lowercase noun.
Just a normal word.
Exactly. It translated to adversary or accuser. In the earliest sections of the text, it's used strictly to describe human opponents in everyday conflicts.
Like military enemies or political rivals.
Yeah, for example, King David is referred to as a potential adversary, using that exact Hebrew word. It's just an everyday descriptor.
Interesting.
But as the texts evolve chronologically, particularly when we get to the books of Job and Zechariah, Satan transforms into something more like a divine job title.
Oh, right. Like in the book of Job.
Yes. In Job, God is presiding over a divine council of heavenly beings, and the Satan, which is written with a direct object marker in Hebrew, is present among them.
And that marker indicates it's a formal title, right? Not a proper name.
Precisely. It's the Satan, not Satan as a name.
Which brings up an analogy I love from our sources. Early on, Satan was less of a comic book supervillain plotting to destroy the universe, and much more like a celestial district attorney just doing his job in God's court.
That is a perfect way to capture the dynamic.
Right. He's a cosmic prosecutor. His role is to test Job's faith, but he only does so with explicit divine permission and within strict boundaries.
He is an authorized part of God's administration. At this stage in history, he's not a fallen angel. He doesn't rule an underworld of demons, and he isn't intrinsically evil.
He's basically just the heavenly auditor.
Exactly, just doing the auditing work of the divine council. So to understand how we get from that bureaucratic courtroom prosecutor to the ultimate terrifying enemy of God, we have to look at historical context and causality.
Right, things change.
They changed drastically due to a massive, traumatic geopolitical event, the Babylonian exile.
Oh, the sacking of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. The temple is destroyed, and the elites of the kingdom of Judah are carried off into exile in Babylon. I mean, that kind of societal trauma completely shatters a worldview.
It creates an existential crisis. If your God is all-powerful and totally supreme, how do you theologically explain your holy city being burned to the ground and your people being enslaved?
Right, you need answers. You need a reason.
And soon after, the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonians and takes control of the region. So for roughly 2 centuries, these Judean elites were living under Persian control.
And coming into close philosophical contact with Persian religious functionaries, right?
Yes. The Persians practiced Zoroastrianism, which is an ancient religion featuring a strict, uncompromising cosmic dualism.
Okay, dualism, meaning two opposing sides.
Exactly. In Zoroastrianism, the universe is a battleground between Ahura Mazda, a perfectly good supreme being, and Angar Monyu, a wholly evil, destructive spirit.
So you have this Judean population whose theology traditionally held that God does everything, the good and the horrific, suddenly exposed to a theology that cleanly separates the universe.
Into a force of pure light and an independent force of pure darkness.
I can see why that would be incredibly appealing. I mean, it gives you a way to explain horrific suffering without blaming your own God.
It solves a massive theological problem for them. By attributing evil to an independent dark force, God's perfect goodness is protected.
Which totally shifts the narrative.
Right. And we see this Zoroastrian influence heavily seep into later Jewish apocalyptic texts composed during the Second Temple period.
Like the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Yes, if you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, they start introducing a distinct two spirits theology, spirits of light and spirits of darkness. You see the emergence of a malevolent spirit called Belial.
Who leads an army, right?
Exactly, an army of evil angels in a literal cosmic war against the archangel Michael in the Sons of Light.
And we also see this mythological expansion in the Book of Enoch. I mean, we get the terrifying imagery of angels actually rebelling and falling from the heavens.
Oh, the Book of Enoch takes a very brief, cryptic mention of the Book of Genesis about the children of God coming down to earth and expands it into a massive epic.
Right, where they're not just hanging out, they're actively devious.
Yes, these devious angels, sometimes led by figures named Shemihaza or Asael, fall to earth and deliberately corrupt humanity by teaching them forbidden knowledge.
Like forging weapons and dark magic?
Exactly. The apocalyptic imagery of stars falling from the sky becomes very prominent. So over several centuries, through profound cultural trauma and exchange, the concept fundamentally evolves.
Right, the pieces are falling into place.
So by the time the early Jesus movement emerges in the first century, the philosophical groundwork is firmly laid for the New Testament's Satan, or Diabolos, to be a specific cosmic enemy of God.
The ruler of demons, the chief tempter of humanity.
Yes, exactly.
But, this strict black and white dualism creates a massive philosophical trap, because if God is all-powerful and perfectly good, but there is this massive, terrifying, evil force operating in the world, causing endless suffering, why does God let him?
Right, the classic problem of evil.
Yeah. Some ancient thinkers couldn't square that circle, and when people look at the world, see all the disease, cruelty, and chaos, and start questioning the very nature of that supposedly good God, well, it leads to our next profound shift.
Yes, this is where the theological roles get entirely reversed.
Which is wild. Tell us about Gnosticism.
Well, that philosophical trap birthed Gnosticism. It was a diverse religious movement that dramatically contrasted with mainstream Abrahamic views.
Because in traditional Christianity or Judaism, God creates the material world, and despite its flaws, it is fundamentally a good creation.
Right. But in Gnostic traditions, they looked at the suffering of life and concluded that the physical, material world itself is inherently flawed, built on decay, and ultimately evil.
Wait, pause. I'm losing the thread here. If the material world is a prison of suffering and decay, the entity that created it cannot possibly be a perfect, loving God. How do they reconcile that without just abandoning religion entirely?
They resolved it by splitting the concept of God in two.
Oh, splitting it. Okay.
Gnostics believed the physical universe wasn't created by the true ultimate God of pure spirit. Instead, it was cobbled together by an inferior, tyrannical, and deeply flawed deity known as the Demiurge.
Sometimes called Yaldabaoth.
Right,
Yeah.
Yaldabaoth. And here's the truly radical part. Certain Gnostic sects explicitly equated this flawed, arrogant Demiurge with the Old Testament God, Yahweh.
They thought the creator God was the bad guy.
Exactly. They believed the true ultimate God was completely hidden and separate from this material prison.
I have to admit, the first time I read this in our notes, my jaw dropped. It is a total inversion of the power dynamic.
It really flips everything on its head.
They are taking the foundational text of Western civilization and just completely flipping the moral poles. They paint the supposed creator God as the ultimate oppressor, the warden of a cosmic flesh and blood prison. But wait, if the creator God is actually the bad guy, what happens to the devil? Who plays that role?
Well, the roles inherently reverse. Because the Demiurge desperately wants to keep humanity ignorant and trapped in the material world, any force that opposes the Demiurge is seen as a liberator.
Oh, wow. So opposition becomes a good thing.
Exactly. So in several Gnostic texts, the serpent in the Garden of Eden is not an evil Satan trying to ruin humanity's paradise. The serpent is actually a hero.
Wait, really? The serpent is the good guy?
Yes. It's viewed as a smuggled messenger from the true higher God, sent to deliver hidden spiritual knowledge, which they called gnosis, to Adam and Eve.
Oh, gnosis, knowledge.
Right. The serpent is waking them up to their imprisonment, acting directly against the tyrannical demiurge's will.
That is just fascinating. It fundamentally challenges you to see how subjective the labels of good and evil can be, depending on who is holding the pen and writing the story.
It really does.
If your ultimate value is attaining spiritual knowledge and escaping the arbitrary rules of a material warden, the rebel instantly transforms from a villain into a savior.
It raises a profound question about the nature of authority itself. The Gnostics were essentially arguing that blind obedience to the creator of a deeply flawed system is actually the true evil.
Right.
In their view, rebellion in the name of enlightenment and truth is the ultimate good.
Which, sets the absolute perfect stage for modern atheistic and secular philosophies.
Yeah.
Because if you take that ancient Gnostic idea of the rebel as a heroic liberator and you remove a literal supernatural god from the equation entirely, the devil doesn't just disappear.
No, the concept adapts.
Instead, the concept is fundamentally transformed into a potent symbol of human autonomy. Now, just to be incredibly clear up front to you listening, as we dive into these atheistic and secular concepts, we are not endorsing any of these specific religious or anti-religious viewpoints.
Of course not.
We are impartially reporting on the diverse philosophies contained in the sources we're analyzing today to understand how humanity makes sense of the world.
And that impartiality is crucial because the ideological shift into secular thought is monumental and highly provocative. Let's look at the 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche.
Right, the guy who famously declared that God is dead.
Yes, but we have to understand his mechanism here. He didn't mean a physical being literally died in the sky.
Right, like an old man having a heart attack on a cloud.
No, exactly. He meant that the Enlightenment and the scientific revolution had made the idea of a literal God unbelievable for modern, educated society. The foundation of absolute truth had collapsed.
And Nietzsche wasn't necessarily cheering when he said that. I mean, he was actually quite terrified. He was looking around at society saying, well, if we remove the divine foundation of all our morals, what stops us from descending into absolute nihilism and chaos?
Precisely. The traditional religious morals derive from that God lost their absolute authority. So for Nietzsche, when that objective moral framework crumbles, Satan transforms. He ceases to be a literal entity hiding in the dark to fear and becomes a vital literary symbol of ultimate rebellion against outdated, restrictive dogmas that no longer serve human flourishing.
So he becomes a literary device. So if Nietzsche dismantled the moral framework, existentialist philosophers like Albert Camus took it a step further into how we actually live our lives.
Camus is a perfect example.
Yeah.
He viewed life as fundamentally absurd and meaningless. There is no grand cosmic plan, no divine safety net.
Right, the myth of Sisyphus pushing the boulder up the hill forever. So, in an absurd universe, what mechanism does Satan represent for Camus?
For Camus, Satan represents the necessary friction in a meaningless machine. We are constantly struggling to find purpose in a world without gods. So Satan is a metaphor for human defiance.
Defiance against the absurdity.
Exactly. In an absurd universe that doesn't care about you, the refusal to surrender, the sheer act of rebelling against the absurdity of it all, is a deeply dignified human act.
That's a crucial philosophical pivot. I mean, it shifts the blame for evil and suffering away from the cosmos, away from a supernatural scapegoat, and places the burden entirely on human will and human choices.
Yes, it is all on us now.
So what does this all mean for groups operating today? Because we see this atheistic philosophy put into highly organized practice with groups like LaVeyan Satanism and the Satanic Temple.
Right, and it requires a clear distinction here. We must separate them from theistic Satanists, who actually do worship a literal supernatural devil.
Right, the horror movie version.
Yes, but atheistic Satanists do not believe in a literal devil, angels, or magic at all. For them, Satan is entirely a symbol.
A mascot, almost.
Exactly. In LaVeyan Satanism, which was founded in the 1960s, Satan represents basic human nature, pride, indulgence, and personal power. It's a deliberately adversarial stance against religions like Christianity that they view as restrictive, hypocritical, or life-denying.
And the Satanic Temple takes a slightly different angle, right? Much more outward-facing and politically active.
They do. They focus heavily on civic engagement. The Satanic Temple takes a highly activist approach. They use the literary and historical symbol of Satan, the ultimate rebel against tyrannical authority, to represent justice, free thought, and defiance against oppression.
Right.
For them, Satan is the ultimate mascot for questioning arbitrary authority and championing human rights in the public square.
Which brings up a really piercing question for me. Does removing the literal supernatural existence of God actually make the concept of the devil more powerful and intimidating for humanity?
How do you mean?
Because think about it. Without a cosmic boogeyman pulling the strings or tempting us in the shadows, we are forced to take full, unflinching responsibility for our own actions. There's no, the devil made me do it.
Oh, I see.
The defiance, the rebellion, the pursuit of justice, but also the cruelty and the malice, it all has to be generated entirely by us. We own our darkness and our light.
That is the immense existential weight of the secular view. Evil isn't an external cosmic force attacking you. It's a construct born from human choices.
Right, it's all internal.
But, if atheists internalize the devil as a symbol of human will and rebellion, it's fascinating to note that many of the world's major religions also internalize the devil.
Wait, religions internalize it too?
Yes. However, they don't do it to celebrate rebellion. They internalize the adversary as the human ego itself, viewing it as the primary obstacle, blocking our connection to a higher state of being.
Oh, wow. Think about how wild that transition is. We've gone from the devil as a massive, literal cosmic dragon, like Leviathan or the multi-headed beast in the book of Revelation, down to the tiny, nagging, selfish voice of ego inside our own heads.
It's quite the shrinking act.
Truly. How do different global traditions frame this internal mechanism of the adversary?
Let's start with Islam, specifically within the Sufi philosophy. In classical Islamic thought, it's important to understand that evil does not have independent power. God alone is supreme.
Right, there's no dualism there.
Exactly. Iblis or Shaitan is not an equal opposite to God engaged in a cosmic war. He is merely a creation who rebelled out of immense pride and now simply whispers temptations to humans.
Says to whisper.
Yes, but in Sufi mysticism, this dynamic is internalized deeply. The devil is cast as the human ego, the nafs. The ego is the literal veil that pulls humans away from the divine reality.
So it's our own selfishness.
Exactly. In fact, Sufism teaches that claiming independent identity, even saying the word I too much, risks arrogance, because true independent existence belongs only to God.
Oh man, think about the last time you got into a heated, pointless argument in a YouTube comment section. That desperate need to be right, that intense, blinding focus on I and me. In Sufism, that isn't just a bad personality trait. That is the literal adversary at work.
That's a very modern way to look at it, but yes.
You are essentially doing the devil's work by feeding your own ego and separating yourself from others.
That is exactly how the mechanism operates. And we see a remarkably similar psychological internalization in Buddhism.
Really? How so?
Well, Buddhism doesn't have a direct equivalent to the Abrahamic Satan, but it has Mara. Mara is depicted as a celestial being, but fundamentally he serves as the embodiment of desire, darkness, fear, and illusion.
Oh, Mara is the famous figure who tried to stop the Buddha from achieving enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, right?
Yeah.
He sent his army of demons, he sent visions of beautiful women to tempt him, he sent storms.
The mythology is very cinematic, yes, but the core teaching is entirely psychological. Mara represents the internal barriers to spiritual progress.
The internal barriers.
Right. The armies he sends are just metaphors for lust, hesitation, fear, and doubt. Mara is the illusion that binds us to the cycle of suffering.
So defeating Mara isn't a physical battle.
Not at all. Defeating Mara isn't a cosmic military battle with swords. It's the internal process of achieving absolute mental clarity and detachment from your own desires.
It's incredible how consistent that internal mechanism is across traditions that don't share the same geography or history. What about Sikhism?
In Sikhism, there is absolutely no concept of a literal supernatural devil. Instead, evil and suffering are generated by a psychological state called duality.
Duality, like feeling separate.
Yes, the illusion of separation from God and from the rest of creation, which is known as Maya. And this duality is actively fueled by what Sikhism calls the five thieves.
Ah, the five thieves. Those being pride, lust, greed, anger, and attachment.
Correct. Imagine walking through life believing you are completely isolated from everyone else, fundamentally in competition with the universe.
Which sounds exhausting.
It is. That illusion of separation is Maya, and it's the engine that powers the five thieves. These are the internal psychological forces that hijack your spiritual focus and steer you into causing harm.
And the Baha'i faith approaches the concept with a very similar psychological framework, don't they?
They do. The Baha'i faith explicitly rejects the idea of an independent, supernatural evil entity entirely. They view Satan entirely as a metaphor for the lower, base, selfish nature of humans.
Just a metaphor.
Right. Evil isn't a thing unto itself. It is merely the result of turning away from the light of God and letting your biological ego define your actions, instead of striving for spiritual growth.
It's truly incredible. If we step back and summarize this entire historical and philosophical journey we've just taken, I mean, we started in the ancient Middle East, where Satan was just a lowercase courtroom title, a celestial prosecutor working for God.
Yes.
Then, through the geopolitical trauma of the Babylonian exile and contact with Persian dualism, that title morphed into a terrifying, independent cosmic enemy. Then, the Gnostics looked at a broken world and flipped the script entirely, turning the adversary into a heroic liberator fighting against a flawed creator.
Total inversion.
Exactly. And then modern atheists and secular thinkers took that baton, stripped away the supernatural completely, and turned the devil into a potent symbol of free thought, justice, and human autonomy. And meanwhile, rich traditions like Sufism, Buddhism, and Sikhism tell us the devil was never a cosmic monster hiding in the dark at all, but rather the daily, internal struggle of our own human ego.
Which perfectly serves to remind us exactly why this kind of historical analysis matters.
Mm-hmm.
Whether you are a devout believer navigating your faith, a staunch atheist finding meaning in an absurd world, or just wildly curious about human nature, tracking the evolution of the devil is profoundly revealing.
It really is.
It shows us that how a culture defines its ultimate enemy reveals exactly what that culture values most. If your highest value is divine obedience and order, your devil is a rebellious, chaotic, fallen angel.
Makes sense.
If your highest value is spiritual enlightenment and unity, your devil is the illusion of the selfish ego. And if your highest value is total human freedom and the defiance of arbitrary authority, your devil inevitably becomes a heroic symbol of liberation.
It's a mirror. The ultimate antagonist is just a reflection of what we're most afraid of losing. Which leaves me with a final provocative thought for you to chew on as you go about your week.
Let's hear it.
We've seen humanity's concept of God and the devil evolve drastically over thousands of years, driven by war, politics, geography, and shifting philosophy. So, what will our ultimate devil look like 1,000 years from now?
That's a fascinating question.
Right. As our society changes, will it still be a spiritual or philosophical concept? Will it evolve into something technological, like a rogue artificial intelligence that embodies ultimate control and the erasure of free will? Or will the devil just become a totally forgotten metaphor, replaced by an entirely new psychological framework for understanding the darkness in the world?
It's a question that really forces us to critically examine what we are building today and what we secretly fear most about our own future.
It really is. Like we said at the start, that historical X-ray machine for diagnosing the universe's ultimate evil is beautifully, wonderfully complex. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning, keep thinking deeper, and we'll see you next time.